Deep in the Pacific Northwest, a young hiker named Aria James followed a fading trail to what many believed was just a myth, a hidden waterfall cave buried beneath layers of moss, mist, and silence. But inside that cave, Aria found a secret no one knew existed, not gold, not treasure, but something far more powerful, a message carved in stone that helped her carry her grief in a whole new way. This emotional story of one woman's journey into the wild and what she brought back from that hidden waterfall cave will leave you breathless and inspired. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. They say some places call to you before you even know they exist. For Aria, that call came in the form of silence, the kind that fills a room after someone you love is no longer there. At just 27, Aria had already felt the weight of goodbye. A free-spirited wildlife photographer from Vermont. She'd lost her older brother, Ezra, 2 years earlier in a climbing accident. Since then, her hikes had become more than just for work. They were her way of feeling close to him again. It was during one of those solo trips, sipping coffee at a rundown cafe in the outskirts of Cascade Mountains, that an old hiker with a map folded like origami told her a story. There's a waterfall out there, deep in the wild. Behind it a cave, hidden for who knows how long. They say no one's ever made it in. Aria didn't blink. That was all the invitation she needed. The next morning, beneath a sky stitched with fog and light rain, she tightened her boots, checked her camera, and stepped into a trail that didn't exist on any app, just instinct, memory, and the need to find something she couldn't name yet. The forest didn't welcome her. Not in the way most people imagined, with sunlight breaking through trees and birds singing overhead. No, this was the kind of wilderness that tested your resolve with every step, overgrown, damp, and eerily silent. It wrapped around Aria like a living thing, watching her, weighing her down. The path, if you could call it that, was little more than a deer trail at best. She followed the markings from the old hiker's map, hand-sketched with arrows and warnings: mudslide here, watch the ridge, cross only at low water. Each scribbled note echoed in her mind as she moved forward, deeper into terrain that hadn't felt a human footprint in decades. By midday, her boots were soaked, and her legs throbbed from climbing sharp inclines where roots jutted out like traps. Twice. She slipped once, landing hard on her side, knocking the wind out of her. She sat there for a moment, mud staining her jacket, and for the first time, doubt crept in. "Maybe this is stupid," she whispered. But then she heard it faint, almost imperceptible. The rush of water, not rain, not stream, a roar, distant and muffled, like thunder behind a curtain. She stood up slowly, wiped the blood off her hand from a scraped palm, and kept going. The terrain grew steeper, moss-covered rocks, slick with years of mist and rain, made footing unpredictable. Aria grabbed tree limbs, crawled on all fours at points, and crossed a freezing river barefoot with her boots slung over her shoulder. Her breath came in gasps, and her fingers were raw from grabbing rough bark and stone. Her camera was wrapped in plastic, swinging on her back like a reminder of why she was out there. And yet, it was something else that pushed her forward. A memory. Ezra standing at the edge of a cliff, arms wide open, wind blowing his curls back as he laughed. "The world's too big to stay in one place," he'd once told her. "Go find the pieces that don't have names yet." She pressed forward. By late afternoon, Aria reached a ledge overlooking a steep descent into a ravine. Her breath caught in her throat. There it was. The waterfall. Not the kind you see in tourist photos. This one was wild, untamed, tucked between jagged cliffs, cascading down like liquid silver. No trail led to it, No rails, no safety ropes. It was raw nature, and it was beautiful. But what stole her breath wasn't just the sight, it was the sound. Behind the roaring water, there was something else. A low hum, a hollow echo. Her heart pounded. She scanned the rock wall behind the falls and spotted a narrow opening barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It was real. The cave was real. But to reach it, she'd have to descend. The slope was dangerous, made up of loose gravel and slick stone. One wrong step, and she'd tumble 30 feet into a sharp, unforgiving basin. She tied a climbing rope around a thick tree root and tested its weight. It held. Aria closed her eyes. In and out, she told herself. Just one step at a time. The descent felt endless. Her fingers clutched the rope so tightly her knuckles turned white. Rain started to fall again, soft at first, then harder, slickening the rock even more. She nearly slipped 3 times before reaching the bottom, legs shaking beneath her. Standing at the edge of the pool below the waterfall, she was soaked, freezing but alive. She stared at the wall of water. It crashed down with deafening force, its mist spraying her face. Somewhere behind it, the cave waited. She approached slowly, testing the slick rocks with each step. When she was close enough to feel the pressure of the falls beating down, she reached out and found a gap. A narrow crevice, no wider than her shoulders. Aria turned sideways, holding her breath, and stepped through the curtain of water. Inside was darkness, pure and complete. The sound of the waterfall became muffled, replaced by dripping echoes and the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. She switched on her headlamp. Light spilled out, illuminating walls of stone shaped by time itself. But it was the silence that struck her. After hours of nature's noise, the stillness inside the cave was almost sacred. She walked deeper, the beam of her lamp catching glints of quartz and streaks of iron in the walls. The passage twisted and turned, revealing chambers large enough to stand in, then narrowing again to crawl spaces. In one of those chambers, she found something that made her stop cold. Carvings. Not natural, not weather-formed, symbols etched into the stone. Lines and spirals arranged in deliberate patterns. She reached out and traced one with trembling fingers. Her breath caught in her chest. They weren't just markings, they were petroglyphs. Her eyes welled up with tears. No one knew about this. No one had documented it. This wasn't just a cave. It was a time capsule, a message from a forgotten people, preserved by the very isolation that had made it so hard to find. In that moment, Aria wasn't cold. She wasn't tired. She was connected to the earth, to history, to something greater than herself. She thought of Ezra, of how he always believed there were places in the world meant to be earned, not simply visited. She smiled through tears. "You were right," she whispered. "It's real." She sat down on a dry patch of rock, her camera in her lap. And for a while, she just listened. Not to the water, not to the wind, but to the silence, the kind that speaks when everything else fades. Aria sat in the heart of the cave, her back pressed against the cool stone wall, the beam of her headlamp dancing along ancient carvings. The silence in the chamber was so complete, so reverent, it felt like a place untouched by time. She should have felt triumphant she had found it, the hidden waterfall cave, the lost petroglyphs, proof of something sacred. But something kept her rooted to that spot, unable to move. It wasn't fear. It was presence, like she wasn't alone. The carvings were unlike anything she had seen, symbols far older than modern tribal markings. There were no figures, no animals, just patterns, concentric circles, arrows pointing inward, and long lines that intersected at sharp angles. They seemed to pulse in the lamp's light, like they had a rhythm of their own. Suddenly, the ground beneath her hand felt strange, not stone, but hollow. She leaned closer, brushing away loose debris. There, beneath a thin layer of dirt and moss, was a flat stone slab, shaped too perfectly to be natural. Carefully, she pressed against it. It didn't budge. She tried again, this time with both hands and her body weight. With a sudden, gritty shift, the slab tilted, revealing a narrow gap beneath. A breath of cold air escaped from the opening, musty and ancient. Aria froze. This wasn't just a cave. It was a tomb. She hesitated. The explorer in her surged forward, heart racing with anticipation. But the human in her, the grieving sister, the soul tethered to something fragile and real, felt the weight of what she might disturb. Still, she took a deep breath, switched her camera to video mode, and slowly lowered herself through the opening. The space beneath was tighter, darker, more like a crawl space than a chamber. Her headlamp flickered, but didn't fail. The passage narrowed before opening into a small room, no larger than a shed. The walls were lined with hand-carved shelves, most empty. But on the far side, something gleamed in the dust. A small bundle, wrapped in animal hide, carefully placed atop a carved stone pedestal. With trembling fingers, Aria lifted the bundle and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a leather-bound book, if it could be called that. It was more like a journal, hand-stitched, the edges brittle with time. Symbols covered the pages, some similar to the carvings on the cave walls, others more refined. And tucked inside the first page was a drawing, faded but unmistakable. A map, not of the area, of the stars. Aria's pulse quickened. She wasn't just inside a hidden cave with ancient carvings. She was holding a document from a lost civilization, one that may have studied the heavens, documented their rituals, even hidden their stories away from the world, right here. And no one knew. No anthropologist, no historian, no database had recorded this place. She realized, with a gasp that caught in her throat, that she was holding living history in her hands, sacred, untouched, and completely unspoiled by modern curiosity. But the awe was interrupted by something unexpected. A sound. Faint at first, like a gust of wind, then sharper, echoing. A voice. She turned off her lamp and held her breath. The cave was pitch black, save for the faint glow of her camera screen. Then again, not a word, not language, but a soft, rhythmic humming, not mechanical, not threatening, almost human. Aria's skin prickled. She crawled backward slowly, clutching the journal to her chest. When she emerged back into the main chamber, the humming faded. She stood there for a moment, breath shallow, eyes scanning the walls. Nothing. The silence returned, but it was no longer comforting. It was watching. With the storm outside intensifying, she knew she couldn't leave yet. The rain had turned to hail, and water was pooling around the cave entrance. Her radio had lost signal hours ago, and her phone was useless out here. She found a dry spot against the stone, wrapped herself in her emergency blanket, and sat with the journal in her lap. The pages called to her not in words, but in weight, in meaning, in silence. For hours, she read. There were no clear translations, but the drawings told a story of a tribe that worshipped light and time, of burials not for the dead, but for memories, of stars as guides, not gods, and a prophecy crude, fragmented about a traveler, a stranger from the outside who would find this place not for glory, but for grief. Tears welled in Aria's eyes. She wasn't here chasing fame. She wasn't here for a story. She was here because she missed her brother, because the world no longer felt like it made sense without him. And now, in the heart of the earth, she had found a place where grief and wonder coexisted. Not by accident, but maybe by design, as the storm outside faded into morning light. Aria stood at the edge of the waterfall again, the journal tucked safely in her pack. She looked back once at the cave entrance, mist curling like fingers around its edges. The voice she'd heard. Maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was her own soul finally echoing back to her after all this time in the place where silence speaks loudest. The trail back was the same wet, steep, wild, but to Aria, it no longer felt like a path through the forest. It felt like a passage through time. Each root beneath her boots, each breath of pine-scented air, each distant bird call felt more vibrant, as if the earth itself had exhaled something ancient through her. And now everything shimmered with meaning. She had entered the cave expecting a hidden place, a pocket of untouched wilderness. What she found was something far deeper, a space not meant for conquest, or stories, or Instagram photos, but for remembering. And she remembered, as she hiked. She thought of the journal tucked in her pack, still wrapped carefully in cloth. It felt heavier than its size, not in weight, but in responsibility. Inside those pages were symbols carved with purpose, a language without sound, a story that had waited centuries for a reader who didn't just look, but listened. She thought of the prophecy crude and fractured about the traveler who would arrive not seeking gold or glory, but carrying grief. That had been her. And she thought of Ezra, how he used to chase the stars with his telescope and a thermos of hot cocoa, how he'd laugh when she couldn't pronounce constellations, how, after he died, she stopped looking up altogether. But the journal, that map, the stars drawn in those ancient pages, they weren't just markings, they were invitations. To wonder, to reconnect, to rise from sorrow without letting go of it. At the ridge where she first saw the waterfall, she paused. Sunlight now broke through the clouds, casting the forest below in a golden haze. The same place that had tested her strength just yesterday now looked like a cathedral of light. Aria dropped her pack gently and sat down, legs hanging over the edge. The wind rustled her jacket. A hawk soared above. She reached into her bag and pulled out Ezra's old compass, the one she'd kept in her coat pocket since the day he was buried. She'd brought it on every trip but never used it. Never needed to. It was never about direction. It was about presence. Now, for the first time, she opened it and stared at the needle. It spun briefly, then settled north. A direction. A grounding. And in that moment, something inside her quietly shifted. For years, grief had been her shadow clinging to her every thought, every plan. But now, it was something else. A thread, a way to feel instead of forget. The ancient ones had understood this. They had carved their memories into stone, not to preserve pain, but to honor it, to carry it forward. The cave wasn't built to keep people out. It was built for those willing to feel deeply enough to enter. She hadn't just discovered a hidden place. She had discovered permission. To mourn, to move forward, to remember without breaking. Aria made it back to the trailhead by nightfall. Her legs ached. Her face was streaked with dried tears and sweat. But her eyes, they were alight. At her car. She paused before opening the door. She turned back to the forest, the shadows now thick with dusk, and whispered, "Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to everything." Over the next week, she camped alone in a quiet clearing not far from town. She didn't contact the authorities. Not yet. She wasn't ready to hand over the journal. It wasn't secrecy. It was reverence. Each night, she lit a small fire, unwrapped the pages, and studied the markings with care. Her camera sat untouched. For once, it wasn't about recording. It was about receiving. She began drawing her own maps, sketching her own stars, writing down what she remembered not just from the cave, but from life, from moments with Ezra, from dreams she'd forgotten, from words left unsaid. And slowly, something bloomed. Not long after, Aria reached out to a trusted professor she'd met on a documentary shoot 2 years earlier, Dr. Miriam Ellison, an archaeologist known for her work in indigenous symbolism. Aria didn't give details, just asked to meet in person. When they finally sat down, Aria didn't speak for a long time. She simply handed over a single drawing, the spiral from the cave wall. Dr. Ellison went still. "Where did you see this?" she asked softly. Aria just smiled and said, "Where the stars meet the water." It wasn't about fame. It never would be. But Aria knew the story couldn't remain hidden forever, not because it was hers to tell, but because it wasn't. It belonged to those who came before, and to those willing to listen now. And maybe, just maybe, the cave had revealed itself to her because she carried not a lens or a notepad, but a wound. And through that wound, she was able to receive a gift no map could offer. From then on, Aria's work changed. Her photos weren't about landscapes anymore. They were about presence. Her captions weren't about angles and filters. They were about feeling. People noticed. There was something deeper in her voice, something steadier in her eye. And when she finally shared the cave's location with preservationists, she insisted on one thing. No fences, no tour groups, only those willing to walk the path in silence and leave with more than they came for. It started with a letter, handwritten, sealed with a red wax stamp, the kind that made it feel like something from another century. It came from a small Native Heritage Foundation in the Pacific Northwest. Someone on Dr. Ellison's team had quietly shared a copy of Aria's sketches, the spiral, the intersecting lines, the map of stars, and the letter began with 3 simple words. We recognize this. Aria sat alone in her studio when she read it, sunlight casting quiet shadows across the floor. She ran her fingers over each line of that letter as though it, too, were carved into stone. The Foundation believed the symbols in the cave shared roots with a long-forgotten dialect of a pre-colonial tribe, a group believed to have migrated far earlier than recorded history suggested. The implications were staggering. But what struck Aria most wasn't the excitement of discovery. It was the tone of reverence in the letter. The Foundation didn't ask her to share photos. They didn't demand GPS coordinates. Instead, they asked, "Would you consider joining us not as a witness, but as a steward?" The word landed heavy. Steward, not explorer, not storyteller, guardian. It wasn't just about sharing what she'd seen. It was about protecting it and allowing it to become what it was meant to be, a space where memory could survive. And silence could speak louder than words. For the first time in years, Aria felt a sense of direction that didn't come from a trail or a compass. It came from belonging. A month later, she stood in a cedar-built community hall, surrounded by elders who spoke in soft, steady voices and moved like trees, slow, deliberate, rooted. They welcomed her with warm hands, careful eyes, and a respect that made her feel both honored and humbled. One elder, a woman named Noma, took her hand after a long silence and said, "The cave opened to you because you were willing to walk in pain. That's the only offering the land accepts anymore." Tears sprang to Aria's eyes, not out of sadness, but out of being seen. Together, they reviewed the journal, the spiral patterns. They explained weren't just spiritual or artistic, they were navigational, pointing to events in the sky, eclipses, comets, lunar cycles. What Aria had mistaken as abstract art was actually a calendar system, thousands of years old. But more than that, the cave itself, based on alignment and construction, appeared to have been a ceremonial space, reserved only for certain rites of passage. A place where grief was not buried, but transformed. "The cave is not a tomb," Noma said, placing her hand over the sketch. "It's a threshold." That word stayed with Aria. Threshold. She had crossed it once, already unknowingly. Now, she was crossing another. Over the next several weeks, she worked alongside the Foundation to plan the cave's future. It was decided that there would be no tourist path, no loud documentaries or social media campaigns. Instead, a limited number of pilgrimage permits would be offered annually by application only, and only to those who demonstrated intention and humility. People wouldn't go to photograph it. They'd go to listen. Aria volunteered to lead the first walk. The morning of the first sanctioned visit, only 3 people stood at the trailhead with her. One was a young woman who had just lost her father to cancer. Another, a middle-aged man with a military past, carrying visible scars and invisible ones. The third was a hospice nurse who had spent 20 years at others' bedsides and never grieved a moment for herself. They didn't speak much on the way in. The forest didn't ask them to. As Aria led them down the unmarked path, through riverbeds and thick moss, over fallen trees and up slick ridges, she didn't narrate. She didn't explain. She let the silence do the guiding. When they reached the waterfall, Aria stopped and turned. "This is the part where you go alone," she said gently. "No one follows you through the water. It has to be your decision." They nodded. One by one, they passed through the veil of mist, disappearing behind the crashing falls. Aria sat by the edge, listening to the rush of water and wind. When the last of them returned an hour later, eyes red, faces quiet, no one spoke. They didn't need to. They had crossed a threshold, and they had returned. Not cured, not fixed, but changed. That night, as Aria sat beneath a sky so full of stars it looked like it might crack open, she opened the old journal once more. This time, she wasn't looking for meaning. She was giving thanks. Not just for what she found in the cave, but for what she found within herself. A sense of purpose. A way to carry Ezra without letting grief carry her. A path forward, not away. And most of all, a doorway that had once been hidden by stone, but was now open for those brave enough to walk through it. The third time Aria returned to the cave, she didn't come as a guide. She came alone, and she came with something to leave behind. It was early fall. The trees had begun to shed their leaves in a hush of amber and rust. The air was colder now, the trail softer underfoot. The waterfall sang the same song. But Aria had changed, and she knew it. In her pack was a small wooden box, hand-carved with a starburst on the lid, a design that matched one of the ancient carvings in the cave. Inside it were pieces of her brother, a dried sprig of lavender from his room, the film canister from the last roll of photos they developed together, and a note she had written to him 10 years ago, folded and refolded so many times the edges had worn away. She hadn't been able to read that letter since the funeral. She wasn't sure she even remembered what it said. But she knew where it needed to go now. The forest greeted her like an old friend, not warm, not gentle, but honest. It still demanded her full attention, her strength, her humility. But this time, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. She walked with intention, not urgency. When she reached the waterfall, mist curling around her boots, she took a long breath and stepped through the wall of water. Inside, the cave was darker than she remembered, or maybe it was just that she could feel the gravity of what she carried. She knelt at the base of the far wall, where the ancient spiral had been etched into the stone, the one that once made her cry without understanding why. Now she did. It was the shape of release. She opened the box, her fingers trembling slightly. The note still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. She didn't unfold it. She didn't need to. Instead, she placed it gently in the hollow at the base of the wall, next to the lavender and the film canister. She whispered her brother's name not loudly, not theatrically, but like a prayer. Ezra. And then she said something she hadn't been able to say aloud for a very long time. You can stay here now. I know how to carry you differently. Her voice cracked, and for a while, all she could do was cry. Not the kind of crying that needed fixing, the kind that washed something away. In the stillness of the cave, something shifted. It wasn't supernatural. No lights flickered, no voices echoed back. But Aria felt it deep in her chest, the lifting of something that had been heavy for far too long. It was the feeling of permission. To move forward without leaving behind, to live without betraying the memory of someone you lost. Outside, rain began to fall again. She didn't rush. She sat for a long time by the cave entrance, watching drops gather on moss and drip onto the earth below. And then, just as she turned to leave, something caught her eye tucked beneath a stone, where the light from her headlamp brushed the edge of the chamber. It looked like a tiny pouch, wrapped in bark and tied with vine. It wasn't hers. It hadn't been there before. Inside was a small piece of carved obsidian, shaped like a crescent moon, and a folded piece of leather with symbols etched into the surface. She brought it to the Foundation 2 weeks later. They translated the symbols with care. It read, "To those who carry loss in silence, you are never alone under the stars." Aria didn't know who had left it. Perhaps another traveler had come before her and left their grief behind, just as she had. Or maybe, just maybe. The cave gave back what it took in the form each heart needed most. From that day on, she began something new. Not a book, not a film, but a circle. A quiet gathering. Once a month, beneath the open sky where people who had lost someone could sit around a fire and say the names of the ones they missed. No sermons, no speeches, just stories and silence, and sometimes tears. People came. They brought photos, songs, small tokens. They cried, they laughed, they remembered, and always, at the end, they stood in a circle, held hands, and looked up because that's what Ezra would have done. And Aria. She still hiked. She still took photos. But her lens was different now. She didn't look for the most beautiful places. She looked for the places where healing could live. And when people asked her why she did what she did, why she gave so much of herself to strangers and sacred places and stories no one else believed were real, she would smile softly and say, "Because someone did that for me, when I didn't know how to ask for it." Years had passed since Aria first stepped through the waterfall and into the heart of the cave. But in many ways, that moment still echoed not just in her memory, but in the lives of those she'd quietly touched since then. What began as a silent personal journey of loss had become something far greater, a living legacy not carved in stone, but in the hearts of people who had once forgotten how to feel, how to remember, how to let go without losing everything. The cave remained protected, sacred, and nearly untouched. Only a few had walked that hidden trail, and fewer had stepped through the curtain of falling water. But every single one who did came out changed. And Aria? She no longer sought to capture beauty, she became part of it. There was one evening late summer when everything seemed to align. The air was golden, the sky brushed in soft strokes of lavender and peach. Aria was sitting on a wide field just outside the Foundation's gathering lodge. A group of people had just completed their silent trek to the cave earlier that week, and tonight was for reflection. Some sat in hammocks between trees, others gathered around the fire. A few simply lay on their backs, watching stars appear one by one, like old friends returning. Aria walked slowly through the field, barefoot, holding a small notebook, the kind her brother used to keep when they were kids. Inside it were notes not about the cave, or the journey, or even about grief, but about people. Stories, moments. One entry was about a woman who had lost her newborn and came to the cave carrying a blanket too small to fold. She left it there, tucked between two stones, and told Aria afterward, "Now I know. She was always meant to be part of something ancient." Another was about an elderly man who hadn't spoken a full sentence since his wife passed 3 years ago. "In the cave," he whispered. "She's in the stars." And when he walked out, he finally looked up for the first time. And then there was the boy, 16, eyes hollow, barely surviving his father's overdose. He said nothing the entire trip. But at the fire that night, he asked Aria, "Do you think places can love people back?" She had smiled with tears in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "some places were made just for that." The fire crackled as night fully settled. A woman from the latest group approached Aria, clutching a small stone she'd picked up near the cave. It had a crack running through the middle, imperfect, raw, beautiful. "Do you ever go back?" she asked. Aria thought for a moment. "Yes," she answered softly, "but not to find something. I go back to remind myself I survived the finding." The woman's eyes shimmered. She nodded, then sat cross-legged near the fire, holding the stone like a promise. Later that night, when the stars had fully awakened, Aria stood alone at the edge of the clearing. She took the leather journal, the one from the cave, from a weathered satchel. Its pages were now protected behind archival sheets, but she still touched them as if they might crumble. She opened to the page with the first spiral, the one she couldn't explain when she first saw it. Now she understood. It was the shape of a journey inward, of something ending and beginning at the same time. She knelt in the grass and placed the journal on a folded cloth. Around it, she gently laid items left by others' feathers, dried flowers, tiny letters, carved stones. Each one carried a name, a face, a moment of letting go. And in that circle of loss, something else lived. Hope. In the years that followed, Aria never chased the spotlight. Others tried journalists, influencers, even major documentary crews, but she turned them all away, not out of secrecy, but out of protection. "This story isn't mine to sell," she once said in a radio interview, her voice low and warm. "It was given to me, and I was trusted to carry it. That's all." The host asked her what the cave meant to her now, after all this time. Aria paused for a long moment, then said, "It's a reminder that even the most hidden things, the darkest places, the deepest griefs can hold light. But only if we're brave enough to walk into them." She never rebuilt her photography career. She didn't have to. She found joy in quiet things, tending gardens for the local hospice, organizing memory walks for grieving teens, and guiding a small circle of volunteers who protected the cave trail in silence and devotion. And once a year, on the same day she first found the waterfall, she would return alone, not to remember Ezra. She carried him always, but to listen to the waterfall, to the cave's silence, to the world inside her that had learned, at last, how to hold on and let go at the same time. So if you ever hear a story whispered in a cabin, or passed between hands at a quiet fire about a young woman who walked through water and came out with something no one else could see, believe it, because somewhere in a hidden corner of the earth, behind a veil of rushing water and time, is a cave that does not echo your voice. It echoes your heart. And if you're quiet enough, if you're broken enough, if you're ready, it just might let you in. Sometimes, the most extraordinary places in the world aren't meant to be discovered by maps or compasses, but by grief, love, and the courage to keep going. Aria's journey teaches us that healing doesn't always happen in bright, open spaces. Sometimes, it waits in the dark, in the hidden, in the places we fear to enter. The cave behind the waterfall wasn't just a location, it was a mirror. It reflected everything she had carried the weight of loss, the ache of memory, the questions that never got answers. But instead of burying those feelings, she brought them into the light and in doing so, transformed them. Her story reminds us that the things we're most afraid to face may, in fact, be the doorways to the deepest peace. Because the most beautiful discoveries don't always lie ahead. Sometimes, they live within. The end. Up next, 2 more soul-stirring stories are waiting. Click to continue the journey, and if this story touched your heart, hit subscribe and walk with us into the next one.